Good morning. It is so nice to see so many people here. Thank you for being here. I'm terrible at off-the-cuff stuff, so I have to do the typed out thing. But, well, I am thrilled to be here today in a room full of people who've basically dedicated their lives to two of my favorite things in the world, education and books. So you guys are my kind of crowd. And I'd like to thank a few people in particular, and Rebecca beat me to it, but I wanted to thank Dr. Pam Brown for sponsoring my visit today, and also the Center for Oklahoma Studies. I didn't even know they were bringing food, that's even better, and the OSU Library. And I would be very remiss if I didn't thank Professor Weber for going above and beyond and making today happen. I'm also especially in awe of all you educators and education students out there, because although I've worked with students from preschool through high school, it was always as the school psychologist. And if you've spent time in a school building yet, then as a teacher, you probably think of the school psychologist as kind of like the grandmother or grandfather of the building, where they come and take the kid out and have time to work on him one-on-one and be all nice. And then when we're done, we just take them back to the classroom and leave them with the teacher for the rest of the day. The one year I actually did work as an English teacher, it was an education for me, because I learned that good teachers have a gift, and I was not born with that gift. So that said, that year of teaching really did change my life. It was the year I got up at 5 a.m. every morning to work on Scarlet Undercover, which was the third novel I've written, just the first one that got published. It was also the year I got a literary agent, which, if you're interested in publishing, you may know that unless you have an agent, most major publishing houses will not consider your work, so that's a big deal. And it was also the year where we took a field trip. It was 7th and 8th graders. We took a field trip to the Greenwood Cultural Center. And that's where the seeds were planted that eventually grew into Dreamland Burning, the novel that I'm here to talk about today. So let's get these slides going. Where am I aiming the pointer? It's because I pressed the center button and not the side. Okay, that's the Greenwood Cultural Center. Sorry, the picture quality isn't that good. But I'll tell you a little bit about Dreamland. I wasn't sure if you would have read it or not. So it is actually the fourth I've written, and if you talk to most writers, they have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 trial runs on their hard drives. That's just the way it works. The Dreamland came out last February, and I call it a hybrid, this is hard, I had to make this one up, hybrid historical contemporary murder mystery. Because a school librarian actually wrote to me and said, "Where do I shelve this?" And I said, "I don't know, please tell me so I can tell other people." But this story opens when Rowan Chase, who is a teenage girl in modern-day Tulsa, and her mother is an African-American attorney, and her father is the white owner of a small oil company. She finds a skeleton underneath the floorboards of her back house, which in the early 1900s would have been servants' quarters. So she calls the police, of course, but the police aren't really interested in this case because the skeleton is clearly really old. It's basically not a cold case, it's an ice cube case. So Rowan and her friend James are interested, and they begin investigating the body, even as Rowan takes a summer job at a health clinic in North Tulsa. And if you know Tulsa, you know that North Tulsa has a predominantly African-American population, and that even though its crime rate is actually the lowest in the entire metropolitan area, a lot of Tulsans consider it the bad part of town. You might also be aware that in the past few years, 2 unarmed African-American men have been shot and killed by law enforcement officials in North Tulsa. So Rowan's chapters are Dreamland's contemporary side, and they alternate with historical chapters narrated by 17-year-old Will Tillman. Like Rowan, Will is biracial. His mother is a homemaker, but she's also a member of the Osage tribe and is wealthy because she has 3 headrights. She's inherited some oil headrights and also has her own. His father is the white owner of a Victrola shop. And Will's story opens with him making a terrible and ultimately tragic decision in a speakeasy, because in 1921 there was prohibition. It still some days feels like there's prohibition in Oklahoma, but we're getting better. As punishment, he has to spend all of his afternoons working at his father's shop. And from there, his chapters follow him as he becomes friends with Ruby, who is a young African-American girl who lives in the Greenwood section of Tulsa, and Ruby's older brother, Joseph. I don't want to throw out any spoilers, so I'll just say that Rowan and James are looking backwards in time to figure out who the body belonged to, and they also have to grapple with an incident of racially motivated violence in their own lives. Will, Joseph, and Ruby are moving forward in time. You eventually witness the death of the person who will become the skeleton, and they're also living through the days building up to what history books call the Tulsa Race Riot, but many Tulsans very rightly prefer to call the Tulsa Race Massacre. So let's backtrack a little bit to that field trip I mentioned, which was where I first saw a series of black and white photographs of men and women who had survived the massacre when they were children. And in those photographs, they were elderly. They had maybe 80s or 90s. Their eyes, though, when you walk down this hallway, their eyes are full of strength. And if you ever visit Greenwood Cultural Center, I hope you do. It's right next to OSU Tulsa. You'll feel those gazes on you as you walk down that hallway. They have stories in them, and I decided on that field trip that those were stories I wanted to track down, and I wanted to listen. So I made an appointment to visit the Race Riot archives, which are housed in special collections at the University of Tulsa's McFarland Library. And all told, there are maybe 2 legal boxes, and they have some letters, National Guard records, some photographs, newspaper articles, and a few transcripts of recorded interviews with survivors, both black and white, so I'm not going to call the white people survivors. But it's not a lot. When you consider how huge this event was, 2 library boxes of loose documents, that's not enough. The truth was the massacre wasn't something that Tulsans wanted to remember. So the stories were kept quiet, documents were trashed, or they were never created in the first place. And there was even an editorial in the Tulsa Tribune leading up to the riot itself that many people believe helped incite the white rioters. No one knows for sure what that article says because it's literally clipped out of the Tribune's archives. Someone made that editorial disappear. I realized in that visit that I had a lot more detective work to do because the story was not there in those boxes. It turned out I did 2 years worth of research before I even felt like I could start writing my way into this fictional story. All told, it took probably 3.5 years before I had my first draft, and that's just the starting point, so there was a lot more work after that. But if you'll bear with me through some history that some of you may already know, I'll give you a summary of what I learned about the massacre. First off, I am an Army brat, and I only moved to Oklahoma in 2001. I've lived here longer than anywhere else now, and it's home. But I did not get 3rd grade and 9th grade Oklahoma history. So I started off by learning the basics, which includes the fact that many African Americans first came to Indian Territory as enslaved peoples of the 5 tribes. I learned that after emancipation, freedmen and freedwomen settled near one another to create communities, and that together with African Americans who joined the Land Run of 1889 and those who came afterwards in search of better lives, they would go on to found over 50 recognized all-black towns. In fact, many settlers hope to see Indian Territory become the nation's first all-black and Native American state. I'm gonna flip forward. Whoops, I skipped a slide. This is a map of the historically black towns. And you can actually go on tours of these. I know the Tulsa Library sponsors a bus tour once a year, and you can go visit and get a guided tour. I don't know if there are any other libraries that do that sort of event. Just to illustrate what an incredibly diverse place Tulsa has always been, this is the Perryman family. Lewis Perryman was part Muskogee Creek, and he was one of the first people to settle in Tulsa. His son Josiah founded Tulsa's first post office. And you can see from this picture This was a diverse, integrated family of birth and adopted children. This is the heart of Tulsa. This, I apologize for the picture, it's hard to find a clear one, of O.W. Gurley. He came to Oklahoma in the land run. He got his 40 acres, which he sold in 1906, and he went to Tulsa and purchased the 40 acres at the northeast corner of downtown that would eventually become the Greenwood section of Tulsa. Now, Mr. Gurley planned from the get-go to only sell parcels of those 40 acres to African Americans. And it was a really good decision because the next year, when Oklahoma achieved statehood, the very first law to go on the books was, does anybody know? Segregation, Jim Crow laws. Those were the first one on the books. But thanks to Mr. Gurley, good things were happening in the Greenwood section of Tulsa. This is a picture of John and Lula Williams. They're a great example of entrepreneurs who came in and purchased parcels of land from Mr. Gurley. John was an automobile mechanic, and I guess he must have been really good because his shop took off. People from all over Tulsa brought their cars to him. He made enough with that garage that Lula was able to go on and start a confectionery, a hotel, and they opened the Williams Dreamland Theater, which is the root of the name of this book. But I also love the metaphor for what Greenwood was, a dreamland. So a few more pictures of Greenwood. This is Dr. A.C. Jackson, who was a physician trained by the Mayo brothers, and he was regarded as one of the most gifted doctors in the country. And from what I can gather, he specialized in women's gynecological disorders, and he was so good that even in this really racially charged atmosphere in the 1920s in Oklahoma, white women came up and were treated by him. So this guy was a good doctor. Let's see. There it is. But by 1921, white resentment toward Greenwood and its really stunning success. Oh, I skipped a paragraph. Wait a minute. Let me go back. Sorry. I got all excited about Dr. Jackson. He's who the clinic is named after in the book, if you notice where Rowan goes and works. So thanks to O.W. Gurley, over time, by 1921, Greenwood consisted of 35 square blocks of homes, businesses, churches, and schools, and it was the most prosperous African American community in the country. And all around the country, it was referred to as Black Wall Street, which didn't go over really well with some of the white citizens of Tulsa, particularly the ones who were joining the Ku Klux Klan, which was just making its way into the state at that point. Unfortunately, Oklahoma was kind of an old hand at lynchings. Of the 31 known lynchings that took place between 1907 and 1921, 26 of the victims were black and 5 were white. One of those white men was named Roy Belton. In 1920, in August, he kidnapped, shot, and killed a taxi driver from Tulsa. The sheriff arrested him, but later that day he was dragged out of the sheriff's custody by a group of vigilantes. They took him out into the countryside and they lynched him. To the people of Greenwood, this proved that not only were suspects not safe in the sheriff's custody, the Tulsa lynch mobs had no qualms with hanging you whether you were white or black, and I'm sure they assumed particularly if you were black. And you could be sure that that was weighing heavily on the minds of the African American community in Tulsa when Dick Rowland was arrested on May 31st of 1921. To this day, this is where we get into the actual events of 1921. The only thing we know for sure about what happened the day before Dick Rowland was arrested is that around 4 p.m. he went into the Drexel building. The restroom on the top floor of that building was the only place he was allowed to go to the bathroom. He worked as a shoe shine on the street below. So around 4, he called the elevator. The elevator was one of those old-fashioned ones that had an operator to level it with the floors. Seconds after he got on that elevator, a woman screamed. It was Sarah Page. and a clerk from Renberg's department store came running to see what was going on. Sarah, as I said, was the elevator's teenage operator, and the best anyone can figure is that Dick Rowland either stumbled into her because the elevator wasn't lined up evenly with the floor, or he simply tripped or stepped on her toes. But whatever the case, he was not a stupid young man, and he ran. Ultimately, this is a spoiler, Sarah refused to press any charges. Dick Rowland was smuggled out of the city. Sarah Rowland left the city, and basically we don't know where they went. But Sarah told the police nothing happened. The assumption, however, was that Dick Rowland had assaulted her. That's how the local newspapers reported it, and that was the charge that the sheriff's office filed against him after he was arrested the following morning at his stepmother's house. Fortunately for Dick, there was a new sheriff, Bill McCullough, and he knew what had happened to Roy Belton and was determined that the same thing wasn't going to happen under his watch. So he took Dick to the top floor of the Tulsa courthouse. This one's been demolished. There's a new one now. It's a lot uglier. He disabled the building's elevators, posted armed men at the top of the stairways, and stood guard himself at the front doors. But over the course of the day, white Tulsans gathered in front of the building. There were calls for Dick Rowland to be turned over, but Sheriff McCullough held his ground. The crowd kept growing and tension kept mounting, and I didn't even put in the notes here, but it was hot. I looked up the temperatures for that day. This was a hot Tulsa day. People are standing around getting angrier and angrier and working themselves up, working each other up. So eventually, by evening, a group of community leaders from Greenwood decided to come down by car to McCullough if they could help him protect Dick Rowland. He sent them home, and the crowd kept growing. It kept getting angrier. A second car full of men came down from Greenwood, and that time there was an altercation between one of the white men in the crowd and one of the African American men from Greenwood. Again, this is a case where no one knows exactly what was said or done, but a single shot rang out. The crowd of white men turned into an angry mob, and all hell broke loose. By the end of the evening, that armed white mob had pushed up to Greenwood's southern edge, where similarly armed Greenwood residents, many of whom had served in World War I, had guns, and knew how to establish skirmish lines, fended them off. Some Greenwood residents had fled earlier that day. There were rumors that this riot was going to happen, which makes you wonder, was it planned? Many more fled as the gunshots rang out that evening, but some stayed. The basic math never changed, though, because for every one African American Tulsan, there were 10 whites. The night got late, the gunshots did quiet down, and the situation seemed to be calming. But never once did the outnumbered residents of Greenwood stand a chance. Because when dawn arrived, it was like a signal went off, and the white rioters waiting at the southern tip of Greenwood just surged into Greenwood. Some of the Greenwood residents were just murdered in cold blood, including Dr. A.C. Jackson, who had, apparently it was 2 young white men were out in front of his house, told him to come out. He came out unarmed with his hands raised, and they shot him in his yard. Others, and these pictures are of men, but this happened to women and children as well. Other residents of Greenwood were gathered at gun and bayonet point. There are literally guns being used here with bayonets on them, and marched through the streets to holding facilities. One of those was Convention Hall, and you might recognize that if you're from Tulsa. I'm going to circle back around to that. And this is a picture of men being assembled. Basically, they're being interned. And some people were taken to the baseball field at McNulty Park. There's also a building further east in town. It's on the fairgrounds. I believe at the time it was a livestock building, and people, I think it still might be, people were marched out there too, and that's a long walk. So while the men, women, and children of Greenwood were being systematically murdered or interned, their homes and businesses were being looted by a steady stream of white rioters who drove north to Greenwood for the occasion. Once the looters had taken everything they wanted, they set fire to the buildings and walked away. One of those buildings that burned was Mount Zion Baptist Church. This church, this is the story that gets me, well, they all do, but this church, they had one chance to worship in this building. They had an $85,000 mortgage, brand new church building, and this is what happened to it. That's Lula Williams' Dreamland Theater after the violence. And that's what Greenwood looked like when the rioters were finished. There was basically nothing left. This is the afternoon of June 1st, 1921. In the days that followed, Greenwood residents were interned at Convention Hall, McNulty Park, and the fairgrounds until a white person came to sign them out and vouch that they were a good black person. Once they'd been released, they were given a green badge that they had to pin to their shirt and wear around to show that they were approved to be walking on the street, which is really frighteningly close to wearing yellow stars in World War II. This is actually a good story. Booker T. Washington High School survived the riot. It's one of the very few buildings that did, and it was used as a Red Cross hospital where Greenwood's wounded were cared for. But even as those residents were being cared for at the hospital, the bodies of many of their dead family members and loved ones were being carried out of Greenwood on train cars and flatbed trucks. At the same time, white Tulsans had already begun placing blame for the violence squarely on the shoulders of the African American community, with headlines like this: 2 whites dead in race riot. Sorry, that was my search term. I couldn't get the red highlighting to go away. And many more whites are shot. This is what the papers chose to emphasize, even though the Race Riot Commission estimated in their official report in 2001 that of the roughly 300 people killed during the violence, the vast majority were African American. And personally, having read as many firsthand accounts and done as much research as I've done, I think that 300 is a pretty severe underestimation, and I am not the only person who believes that. There are reports of crop dusting planes coming over and bombing Greenwood. When I wrote the novel, those had not been confirmed, so I chose not to include them. I tried to focus on only verifiable historical facts, but there's been some pretty compelling evidence to come out since then that that absolutely did happen. On top of the deaths, over 8,000 people were left homeless in the riot. Some moved away to stay with family in other cities. Some lived in a tent camp through the winter as they rebuilt their homes themselves. Because when Greenwood's property owners and business owners filed claims with their insurance companies, those companies told them it was an act of man, not of God. Every single one of their claims was denied. Now, offers did pour in from around the country. Other cities, people in other states were trying to send in donations of food and goods and money to help the people of Greenwood recover. Tulsa city leaders refused every one of those offers. Those same city leaders attempted to pass zoning laws that would have turned Greenwood into an industrial zone. Basically, they wanted to set up a buffer region between the white community and the black community and force the black community to move further north. Thankfully, those efforts, for the most part, failed because of attorneys like B.C. Franklin and others who were working to represent the community. In the end, a lot of Greenwood residents did leave. And in fact, I got an email from a man whose grandfather was the architect for the Dreamland Theater. And his family didn't live in Tulsa, but after the massacre, they left. He's in Chicago now. But a lot of people stayed, and Greenwood did rebuild, including, this makes me smile. So that congregation that had built their church building with an $85,000 mortgage did not get any insurance money to cover it. So they said, all right, give us another $85,000 mortgage. And they rebuilt their church, and over the years, they paid off both of those mortgages. Ironically, one of the things that contribute, because if you've been to Greenwood today, there's not a lot there. And ironically, one of the things that contributed to its economic downfall was the end of Jim Crow, because residents of Greenwood could shop all throughout Tulsa, so those businesses slowly shuttered. It didn't help either that Tulsa chose to build its interdispersal loop basically right over Greenwood, which physically separates Greenwood from the rest of Tulsa. But Greenwood is still there. This is a picture of the southern end of its business strip. And OSU Tulsa is just up there. Some of you may park there and take the bus. This is the Maybelle Little house. Maybelle Little was a hairdresser, an entrepreneur in Greenwood. This was not actually her house, and this is actually a reconstruction of a house that did survive the riot. It kind of fell down with the economic downturn, but they rebuilt it. This is part of the Greenwood Cultural Center, and to my knowledge, it is still being renovated, so I don't know if you can visit. But if you can, it's fun to go in and see the house. The man who lived there was a Pullman porter, and his hat's there. I just think that's a cool thing. And Booker T. Washington High School continued on strong once it served its term as a Red Cross hospital. It eventually moved to a larger campus in northeast of its former location. And today it's a magnet school and one of the best high schools in Tulsa. My daughter goes there, go Hornets. And I love it because it is a diverse school. Its students represent the actual population of Tulsa. And I love it because when you go to events, the traditions at this school go back to before the massacre, and it's a blast. We just did homecoming. It was fun. So if you look for them still, there are unpleasant reminders. I hate to say this about the Brady. They bring good musical acts. But this was Convention Hall. It's the Brady Theater now. And I think, I like the irony here. R. Kelly was playing when I took that picture. That's a good thing. And there's no denying that overt and institutionalized racism underlying the massacre and its cover-up helped shape Tulsa's evolution into a modern city. There's no legalized segregation anymore, but we are still a city divided by railroad tracks. Remember how I mentioned that North Tulsa has the lowest crime rate, but is still the bad part of Tulsa? That's the same deep-rooted racism that didn't just contribute to the riot, the massacre. It was, the flames were fanned by it also, because after the massacre, KKK membership in Oklahoma exploded. I didn't really understand all this until I did my research, and then came the process of thinking about how to fictionalize it. One thing I did know for certain was that out of all the resources I came across in my research, by far the most compelling were the transcripts and voice recordings of survivor interviews. In other words, the stories that the men and women's eyes were giving off in those pictures at the Greenwood Cultural Center. This is just one example of where you can find survivors being interviewed. This particular one was with Otis Clark, who I believe was 106 during this interview, and sharp. He had not lost anything. And there's another story that I'll just tell you briefly. This one I read a transcript of. A historian had interviewed Vernice Sims. In 1921, Vernice was a junior at Booker T. She told this historian about how up till then, her father had never allowed her to go on an unchaperoned date. But the prom was coming up. It was supposed to be June 1st, which you'll remember is the date that picture of the devastated Greenwood area was taken. And a young man had asked Vernice to go to prom with him, and her father had finally agreed. So Vernice had a new peacock blue dress made. She volunteered to help decorate the Stratford Hotel where the prom was supposed to take place. And on May 31st, as rumors of the riot were building, she left her beautiful dress laying on her bed when her father told her bad things were happening down at the courthouse, and their family was going to leave Greenwood just until things settled down. Vernice never got back to that home in time to put on her dress. In fact, there was no prom. The Stratford burned, and Vernice never saw her home again. It was looted and destroyed. In the interview, she said that she had spent years after the massacre walking through the streets of Tulsa, terrified that she would see a white woman wearing her prom dress because she honestly didn't know what she would do. That's Vernice's story. Mr. Clark's story is his. And there are so many others out there waiting for students and readers to find. I'd mentioned a couple of them in the author's notes. And I also clarify that any of the characters in Dreamland Burning who have dialogue, so if there are quotation marks around what they say, those are fictional characters out of my head, because the stories of the survivors are theirs to tell, and I didn't feel entitled in any way to tell them for them. I hope you'll go find some of them, either at Voices of Oklahoma or through your library system. They're out there. As a side note here, I'll mention, it got to be kind of an ugly joke between my husband and me, that all the times I would meet with white Tulsans who heard what I was working on and wanted to share their own families' anecdotes about the massacre, I always heard about their grandpa or great-grandma or great-uncle Joe who had saved a black person's life by hiding them in the closet or the cooler or the attic. Never once did someone say, oh yeah, you know, my great-grandfather shot 3 unarmed men that night. Or, yeah, my great-aunt Tilly's stole our family's prized silver from a house up on North Elgin. I don't doubt that the good stories I heard were true. But at the same time, the fact that the bad stories are either kept quiet or were never handed down in the first place points to one of the most difficult obstacles historians and historical fiction writers face, which is getting the whole story. I like to think of it this way. So, this is my personal photo album time. You can see this is a Facebook memory, and it popped up a few weeks ago. I posted this originally in 2013, and it's my daughter Sophie when she was 9. So let's break it down, how this relates to the passing down of history. I am a terrible mother. I almost never take pictures of my kids. It's really bad. Another parent took this shot and shared it with me, which I'm grateful for. I'm also a terrible daughter, niece, and friend because I never remember to post things on Facebook. This was a rare exception. Why did I post this when I'm so bad about it? In retrospect, I'm pretty sure I posted this because my kid looks like a badass. She was a great soccer player, and I wanted to share that. I was bragging. I can't remember a single thing about this day, though. I don't remember who won the game. I don't remember if we were playing in Oklahoma City or Tulsa. I can't remember whether I had to wake her up and shove a Starbucks, what are those? I used to give her refreshers because she wouldn't wake up and I wanted her to get caffeine. I'm a horrible soccer mom. She doesn't play anymore. I don't even remember if she had fun playing. Most of the time she did, so there's a good chance she did. So while a tiny bit of that history from that day was preserved, most of it's gone. And the little bit that remains was selected by me to tell a story about my daughter's life and my life that I liked and I wanted to share. Basically, I was shaping my own history to fit the way I wanted it to be. And there's nothing inherently wrong with this. Life comes at it 1,000 miles a minute every day, and there's no way we can remember it all. But if you multiply individual decisions about what parts of history to preserve, by the likelihood that their interpretation is very different from the interpretation another person may have of the very same event, then you factor in how much just gets lost or deliberately forgotten or reinterpreted to suit the whims of people over time, then you start to appreciate what an amazingly complex and slippery thing history really is. That's why when I set out to do the research for Dreamland, I decided to do as much of it as I could using primary source documents. Thank you, librarians. In addition to the survivors and interviews letters that I mentioned, I read all of the newspapers and magazine accounts I could find from all over the country, but in particular, I emphasized the newspapers that were published in Tulsa at the time. So the Tulsa Tribune and the Tulsa World were the 2 white-owned newspapers. Prior to their destruction during the massacre, the Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Sun were the African-American-owned newspapers. I found a tremendous number of resources online through the Library of Congress and also the Tulsa City County Library and the Tulsa Historical Society. I also used the FBI website, which is really kind of cool. They've got a lot of stuff up there. I used the Osage and Muskogee Creek Tribes websites. I went through Ancestry.com. I set up an Ancestry account and just fished around until I found interesting stuff. Census records were really helpful. World War I draft card databases are really interesting. And I found original maps, and all of the locations that I used in the book were cross-checked against the Polk Hoffine City Directory, which lists every single address, every resident, every building. I'm working on a World War II book now set in Rhode Island. The first thing I did was go on ABE and try to find a directory from Newport from that time period, and I found one. So, people in the Tulsa community were also incredibly generous with their expertise and insights into the massacre itself, into the history and redevelopment of Greenwood. Also, I had a forensic anthropologist who was awesome. I got to learn how bodies decayed. And I relied heavily on some Native American historians to make sure that I was doing a good job in representing the Native American characters, or at least not jacking it up too badly. This is another example of a primary source that I love. This is a page from the 1921 Booker T. Washington High School yearbook. And I didn't include the actual people, but I describe what these pages look like. And it appears towards the end of the novel when Rowan and James find this as a clue. I threw this slide in too because this is from the Tulsa Star, which was an African-American owned newspaper. And I put it in because if you look over right there, the ad for radium water, stuff like this, you cannot make it up. Apparently this bathhouse would let you take a bath in radioactive water to improve your health. That snuck its way into the book too, okay. The idea for the Victrola shop came from an advertisement in a newspaper that I saw, and the cigar shop that Vernon Fish owns also came from a newspaper advertisement. And I did go and cross-check with the Polk Hoffine directory that there were no Victrola shops, to my knowledge, in Greenwood. So a resident of Greenwood would have to find a shopkeeper in White Tulsa willing to sell to him. I also geeked out on VictorVictrola.com. I made sure that all the model numbers and prices that are used for the Victrola in the novel are accurate, as is the description of this dictaphone that figures into the mystery's resolution. So hopefully everything I've said up to now has given you some insight into how a research geek like me writes historicals. But the one big question left that I know a lot of readers have had, but only a few have asked me face to face, was asked by a young man. I went to Richard Wright High School in Washington, D.C., which is a media and journalism and media arts school. It is 98.9% African American. It was the very first place I ever spoke publicly about the book. I was nervous. I didn't need to worry. The kids were amazing. They had such incredible questions about the massacre, about what it's like to write a book, about what it's like to be published. They told me my website and social media presence sucked, but they were much more polite in the way they said it. And we got to the end, and we just had a little bit of time left, and there was this young man. He asked me 3 questions, and he raised his hand a 4th time, and I called on him. You could just see he got really tense, and he didn't know what to say. I knew what he wanted to ask. So I said, "Do you want to know why a middle-aged white lady wrote this book?" And his face lit up, and he relaxed. And he said he was relieved I'd put it out there, and I was relieved enough that I could give him the best answer I had, which is that the portraits on the wall at the Cultural Center had made me want to learn. And that I didn't believe this was just African American history. This was American history. And I also believe that if people aren't willing to talk openly about racism and to make mistakes and to be willing to learn from those mistakes when they get called out on them, then history will just keep repeating itself over and over. We had a really wonderful discussion about that. We also talked about the need for more diverse voices to be published in mainstream publishing, the need for own voice as writers to write about what happened in Tulsa, to write about all the race massacres that happened during the Red Summer of 1919 and the lynchings. My book is not the end-all be-all. I hope this makes more writers of color want to write own voices novels depicting the events. And in fact, there's a guy, he's so amazing. He got in touch with me. He writes musicals in New York, and he wants to write a musical about Greenwood. So he came out and stayed with us, and I think there might be like a Hamilton-esque account of the race riot coming down the road, but he wants to tell the story from the points of view of two young African-American men living in Greenwood faced with choices and how to react to Dick Rowland's imprisonment. And I think that's going to be fabulous. His name's Ronveyo Daniel, and you heard it here first. So I have been thinking a lot, especially since Professor Weber invited me, about why fiction like this matters to you as educators and librarians, especially in our current climate that emphasizes science, technology, engineering, and math. We're obsessed with it as a culture. The answer I came up with is simply this. Fiction matters because history, ethics, language, writing, and art matter. Fiction comes to bear on every single one of these. At its best, fiction engages readers and makes them invest in stories that are bigger than their own. It challenges them to wrestle with tricky ideas and tough problems that don't have easy solutions. This is important for everyone, but I think it can be especially important for scientists, tech gurus, engineers, and mathematicians, because while physics has given us the moon landing and space exploration and positron emission tomography, it also gave us Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it was the humanists and the thinkers who worked through the ethical issues related to that, right or wrong. And biologists may be doing great genetic research, and there's just a quick rundown of all the things we're getting out of that. But genetics also led to horrors like the Holocaust, and as a justification for eugenics programs. I like this, the way this puts it. You can tell, science can tell you how to clone a Tyrannosaurus Rex, but humanities can tell you why this is a bad idea. So, kind of wrap it up. This is going longer than it took when I read it in the mirror. When it comes to historical fiction in particular, I grew to understand that when we learn the history of our community, of our town and state and nation, we're able to sink deeper roots and become more invested in what happens around us. Awful as the Tulsa Race Massacre was, learning about it and learning about Tulsa and Oklahoma's history changed me forever. I got to basically immerse myself in this city's history for 5 years, and that changed the way I saw modern day Tulsa. I drove my kids nuts because we now live fairly close to downtown, and the PSO building in Tulsa used to be Central High School, which was the white high school that Will Tillman went to in the novel. Every time we drove past that for like 6 months, I'd say, "Did you know?" Yes, we know. But it really was a process of Tulsa becoming my community and my home in all its complexities. So right now, with our country struggling to come to terms with blatant displays of racism and violence and truly bitter political division, we need all the community we can get. Plus, I think it would do all of us good to go back and reread The Red Badge of Courage or The Book Thief or any one of the amazing books out there that challenge us to think about what honor and patriotism are and what it means to be a moral human being. Over the 5 years it took to research, write, edit, and publish Dreamland, I learned that history is a complicated thing made up of thousands, millions of stories. You teachers and librarians have the amazingly difficult task not only of curating the information your students learn, but of helping them move beyond rote memorization to actual synthesis, to questioning what they're told, and to thinking for themselves. I don't envy any of you. I know what a hard job it is. The very idea of it really overwhelms me. As I said way back at the beginning of the talk, I am a terrible teacher. But I am in complete and utter awe of what all of you do or are studying to do. I want you to know that for me and most of the authors I know, there is no greater compliment than knowing one of our books has made it into a library or a school library or even a classroom. I love hearing from librarians that they gave my book to a reader and they had very specific reasons for doing that. We fiction writers are hermits. We peck away at our little lonely keyboards while you're on the front lines. But one thing's for sure, We writers have your back, I promise. And I left time for questions, even if they're hard ones. How many of you guys have actually read the book? Oh gosh, there were no spoilers then. You pretty much know. One question I like to put out, and I knew it when I was writing it. This was usually when you're writing, you're just kind of trying to catch lightning by the tail, and what comes out, and then you fix it in revisions. But I was very deliberate when I wrote the ending. Oh gosh, this is a spoiler. But do you think you know who killed the person who became the body? Raise your hand if you think you know, if you read the book and you're like, I know who killed him. I don't know myself. I'm sure you can make your own call, but I very deliberately decided to make it blurred so that you could decide for yourself which of the two individuals killed him, because in my mind, it didn't matter. That person just needed to go. And I can tell you, the days when I wrote a really racist character in the novel, my kids knew when I'd done it, because it's an ugly place to put yourself to write with that voice. But the day that was resolved, if you read the book, you know what I'm talking about. That was a good writing day. That was the most fun I've had killing anybody ever. Any questions? Anybody want to write? Have questions about publishing? Yeah.
Have you ever thought about writing elementary age books?
Have I ever thought of writing elementary age books? It's such a the publishing market is really tricky. The librarians know this. So there are picture books, which I thought, those are so easy. I'm just going to write picture books. No, those are the most restrictive form. You have to write them, you probably know. Picture books, people like Tammy Sauer here in Oklahoma can write those suckers, and they're great, and they just pop them out. I tried it once, and my agent said no. Then there are the chapter books and early readers. It's a funny little niche where if you're a writer who writes one of those books that has the reading level marked on it, 1, 2, 3, 4, then the publishing companies keep coming back to you and saying, we need a book about this topic. Can you do it? So it's really a specialized little niche. I am going a little bit younger. My first book was a pure middle grade. There were no curse words at all. It was very sweet. I'm going backwards a little bit with this next book to pick up some younger readers. Dreamland, I've been surprised. I know an 8th grade classroom and a 7th grade classroom that have used it, and there's heavy stuff in there. There's language to talk about. But the next one, I want it to be able to go all the way down to the little guys. Yeah?
This is kind of a personal question.
Uh-huh.
But since you've done all this history about racism and everything, do you ever feel frustrated as a white woman? Do you ever feel like there's racism on both sides, and that being a white woman, do you ever feel frustrated that white people are grouped into the typical white man that's racist for black people? Do you ever feel frustrated at that? Because there's a lot of us who aren't racist at all, but we're grouped into that racist group because we're white. Do you ever feel frustrated about that?
Okay, so do I ever feel frustrated that I'm being pigeonholed as a white woman as possibly being racist? And my answer, at both sides, so there's racism on both sides. One, I don't believe that there were good people on both sides, if you know the reference I'm talking to. That said, I think we're in a period where society is righting some serious past wrongs. The very honest answer is there have been times where I've been frustrated, where I thought more people would have read this book if I were a writer of color. And that's a brutally honest answer. But the thing that I know and I tell myself is that suck it up. There's a lot of making up to do. I want writers of color to have their books out there. I know that everyone in some corner of their being has some kind of racist thought. We all do. So rather than dwell on am I being pegged as a racist, I hope not. I do my best. I work at overcoming any racist tendencies in me that may exist every day, but I know that that's an ongoing battle. So that's the honest answer, that rather than think about, am I being discriminated against? I would much rather say, that's a big question. Let's all talk about it together and get it out there, even if it's hard and ugly to talk about. I saw another hand. Yeah.
Mine was, what made you get a literary agent? You said your first two books, you didn't have one, and you didn't get one to your third one. So is there a reason why you waited, or?
So why did I wait to get a literary agent? I should have made that clearer. I actually didn't. I wrote the first book, The Sweet Little Middle Grade, and that book got me an agent. She shopped it. It got all the way. The book publishing industry, it's crazy. It's frustrating. You don't make any money. It's just a tough business, unless you're Cassandra Clare or J.K. Rowling, then you make a lot. But that first manuscript got all the way to the acquisitions committee, which is the final stage before a book is accepted by a publisher. And it was Scholastic, so they do school and library book fairs. And the school and library marketers came in, and my bad guy was a 5th grade teacher. So school and library said, no, we're not going into book fairs with that. So that was crushing. I was this close. I was waiting for the call from my agent to hear that acquisitions had approved it. The second book was awful. I tried to do fantasy. Scarlet, I still love that book, and I love hard-boiled detective stories. That's what I like to read. I love Dashiell Hammett, and James Ellroy is awesome. But I think this is where I found what I'm meant to do with historical fiction, because I'm technically ABD in psychology. I did everything but the dissertation. I did the clinical training. I worked at the master's level. Don't do that to yourself. But I had some big life events come up. Like, if you're on track for a PhD, just finish it. And my thoughts drifted there. I forget what I was saying. Thank you. I'm a researcher at heart. Thankfully, I don't have to do experiments on people anymore, kids. I actually specialized in reading acquisition, so I listened to a lot of phonemes being pronounced by kids in headphones. Anybody else? No? Yeah.
I'm not sure how to word this, but we've been discussing a lot about bringing a book. Like, I don't know if I can teach this book. I teach 8th grade, and so I don't know if I could actually teach this book in my classroom, but I want to have it available in the classroom library. But I have done literature circles and things like that, which are like small groups of readers in class reading the same book. We are discussing a lot of how do you approach race with kids. I mean, we're struggling to figure out how do we bring up this topic without it turning into a huge catastrophe. You know, we don't want it to, we want to bring the kids together, not pull them apart. And so how do we do that without, I don't know, having civil discourse instead of frustration between the students?
Okay, so how do you how do you discuss racism with a class? I would say it depends a lot on the composition of your class, and even more importantly, on the composition of your class's parents. They're the sticking point a lot of times. I know you know that. Like my daughter at Booker T, they have open discussions because that's the environment. But in a mainstream, you do 8th grade, middle school, the way my younger daughter's librarian has resolved it is she has a special shelf that only the 8th graders are allowed to read. That's one thing. The other is knowing that you know the kids in your room, think about whether or not it's you who are, we're afraid to talk about it. This is hard stuff. Most of the time, the kids aren't. So unless you have little streaks of conflict going through your classroom already, I would say that probably the kids are way more capable of having an open and honest discussion than you guess they will be. Kind of like when I went to Richard Wright, and these kids are like, yeah, let's talk about this. And I'm sitting there looking at their very senior, distinguished-looking librarian thinking, oh, crap, I'm going to step in it. The kids took it over. They knew what to do. Have faith in them. And don't blame me if it goes wrong. Yeah.
How hard was it for you to find like a place where the two stories connect? Because I know like it connects at Harding, but like when did you figure out like that's it?
So how did I figure out how to connect the two stories? Honestly, I didn't even have Rowan as a storyline when I first started writing the book, but the first shooting did happen as I was writing, and I was like, this is still happening, I need to bring it in. I didn't have something to, the skeleton is basically where I tied them together. And we moved from a suburb of Tulsa into Tulsa proper, so Zoe could go to Booker T, basically, we wanted to be in district. And when we got there, we do not live in a mansion like Rowan does, but we live in that neighborhood, and there's a small back house that was converted from a garage when World War II vets came back, and we were renovating it. The floor had sunk, so they were piering it, and they cut it out. They cut out the wood floor, and I walked back, and I was like, oh, there could be a body in there. So it was literally construction. And by the way, the story that James tells later on about the nasty contractor who rips off the Mexican guy because he doesn't have papers, that was our contractor. So literally the thing that tied my two stories together was a hole in the floor. It was really tricky navigating how far I wanted to push in Rowan's storyline. I decided I didn't want to go with an actual police shooting, even though in essence I think of those deaths are very similar. So I tread very carefully, and I relied on Dr. Jocelyn Payne, who at the time was running the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation. Also Sunday Frazier, who tends to write for younger readers, but she was a sensitivity reader for me. They helped me navigate the ways that I could thread together the racism that both characters face, Rowan and Will, in the two time periods, and I'm really grateful for their help. I think that is about our time. Thank you guys so much for being here. It was great.